Now I would like to open the floor for questions. So we have about half an hour. Yes.
I just have to leave. No, this was fascinating, but just a couple of points, and I thought this would help probably shape the discussion forward. I think somewhere the word respect that Kant so clearly emphasizes on in understanding the notion of dignity. I think I absolutely agree when you say that Kant is the person who brings in the self into the aspect of the Western notion that the public response you get to an individual is largely constituted in function of dignity. That's absolutely true. It is also compatible with a lot of the non-Western thinking that has gone behind the concept of dignity. If you look at, for example, Krishna's notion, right, where you're trying to understand mostly focusing on the self and the respect that you're getting, and that creating the response that you're likely to achieve. Now, it's interesting what Ambedkar brings into this forte, because he's aware of what has happened on the theological side of things with the Brahmanical control. So he's seen that that is no longer the way you look at the notion of respect unless and until the public response is made compatible. So one of the things which is interesting is that somewhere, if you're just philosophizing this notion, Ambedkar has filled in to the shoes of someone who has brought a synthetic dimension to Kant and the Western theological, or you would say conceptual framework of dignity. And that's something which is very important because Kant himself failed to harmonize the notion of self-respect as against being with the public response aspect. He's more analytical than synthetic in his notion. I think this is very important that Ambedkar brings it using law as or a social movement as a force. So it's very interesting how you've traced it back. But I think that's the side of the story which is very clear if you look at what Ambedkar is doing. Where there is a notion of disbalance between self-respect, he says, no. This is a function of how you respond to a person, a Dalit, right? If a Dalit finds himself to be valuing less, it is because you don't see what is happening outside in terms of your response. So he's speaking to Dalits and those outside that purview in two different voices because he knows what is the lack that Kant and the different frameworks. So you see that a lot in his influence on John Dewey. And that's something which is very interesting in his own influence on how the synthetic analysis. Sorry, I have a meeting.
Yeah, no, thank you.
I thought I'd just bring
No, I think it's great. I'm going to talk, if I'm allowed to talk more, I'll address that point. Okay, bye.
So I'm I think just not exactly the same point, but picking up on that. So when dignity becomes one, as you said, part of the UN human rights framework, and then as a result, states have to guarantee in their own constitutions. And taking you back to what you had said initially, the role of the state in sort of according dignity, respecting dignity, or ensuring that dignity remains. To what extent does it then get linked to the idea of citizenship? And I'm not very sure whether Ambedkar talked about citizenship in a particular way, but how does the concept extend to the idea of citizenship when we're talking about nation states as the units which are supposed to ensure dignity?
Do you want to take questions further or answer these?
Sure.
Okay. How do you want to do it? Do you want to take all the questions?
Yeah, I don't want to talk more. I'll just reply.
Okay, you take all the questions.
Yeah.
No, fascinating. I wondered if you have anything to say about Henry Maine talking about the movement from status to contract, because that again in law, it signifies this move away from a society which had dignities and honors and status to moving even away from the family to the individual, and the individual being in a position to enter into a free contract by free will, right? So there is an element of that. So I'm wondering how you tie up that, because it's what might be the philosophical lineage of Henry Maine's famous status to contract move.
Yes.
I think for students, I'm willing to wait.
Okay. Any questions from? Yes. any question? Yes, yes, Arun. Yeah.
I had a sort of theoretical question. You mentioned that the inherent dignity that a person has is something that they sort of recognize within themselves. However, there's a gap in the recognition of another individual's dignity. My question is, does this lack of recognition of another individual's dignity, do you think that can stem from a notion of clearly there is a social contract in understanding someone else's self-worth as well. My question is, where, according to you, does that gap come from? And can that be attributed to some lack of sort of understanding or empathy that is missing, or is it attributed to a larger sense of not being able to sort of comprehend the fact that one's own dignity can also be imbued in someone else's as well?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I actually missed about 20 minutes. I have to go for an urgent meeting. So I'm sorry if I'm going over ground that you've already covered, but this means to an end. Adam Smith was a contemporary of Immanuel Kant, and they were familiar with each other's work. I'm sure, I believe Kant was familiar with British political economy, and he was familiar with the model of competitive man that was being propounded there. And that model is very much of each individual as a means to an end for another. Like, it's not from the it's not from the generosity of the butcher that you get your meat. It's from interesting him to to fulfill his needs by meeting yours, right? That's a famous quote from Adam Smith. Means to an end. Everybody's a means to some end or the other. But then, I mean, he kind of has some kind of a bulwark against this kind of generalized state of competition leading to conflict.
You mean Smith?
Smith, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
In the notion of empathy, there's
Yeah.
underlying this sense of empathy, which is what becomes his invisible hand, which has been kind of abused as a kind of
Right.
justification for this free competition. This liberalized kind of competition. But the notion of empathy then kind of has a different kind of lineage, which goes through some kind of mutation and emerges as a notion of civility and a notion of civil society. There is a consensus that is irrespective of the coercive law of the state, which impels you to be civil to each other. And Kant himself sees this as emerging from competition, because every person rises to a state of rationality, and he becomes subject to the universal law of reason, and you have a perfect civic constitution emerging out of that. But reality shows that this is all too prone to fall into conflict, and if you look at post-World War II, is the welfare state, in a sense, the practical embodiment of what you would call as the dignity of the individual? And how would you see the current kind of turmoil within the welfare state paradigm, which you see across Europe, in USA and so on, as impinging on this on the construct of dignity? Because I also would refer to theorist of civility and the nation state, Edward Shills, who speaks of dignity as civility as the respect of each individual for the dignity of another. And he sees that the nation state framework is essential to safeguard that. But I think today you see that both the welfare state and the nation state are under some kind of stress. And is this a generalized crisis of enlightenment thinking? Do we need to go beyond the Kantian and as also transmitted to us through the Constitution and Ambedkar and so on? Do you see lacuna there which we need to transcend?
Yes. Yeah.
So, also you talked about the conception of dignity in terms of public recognition, and my question is associated with that. Do you think that this conception of dignity in terms of public recognition transitions into collective identities as well? And if it does, then how does it play a role in, say, conflicts between communities or among communities in terms of, and the conflict could be of any kind. It could be a religious conflict, could be other community-based conflicts. So do you think this individual idea of dignity in terms of public recognition transitions into collective identities also?
Just to clarify, when you say conflict with individual and community, are you saying a conflict between an individual from a community and an individual from another community? Or are you saying a conflict from an individual and her own community?
No, I'm asking if this transitions into a conflict between two communities.
Yeah, okay.
Not individuals within a community.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Akash, for your very fascinating talk. I'm very curious to know about that you have mentioned the right is parallel to dignity, or the dignity is parallel to right. This is really interesting point that you made. And on the idea of dignity, recently a scholar, he has written a piece, brilliant piece, that where he is making a point that it is Ambedkar before 1945, before the Declaration of Right, and UN. So he is making this point from 1990, remember the South Borough Committee, right? And there is this concept of dignity, it is invisibly present there, which we need to trace, because Ambedkar is tracing the idea of inherent discrimination. Then the idea of dignity is coming. So this is one. And second thing, when we talk about dignity, it is also a moral concept sometimes. Not sometimes, it is a moral concept. Then if it is a moral concept, then it is relegated to the individual per se, then there is a mistake. If it is relegated to individual per se, then it is a mistake, because the idea of dignity comes into play when there is a humiliation, right? So this is what I would like to know how you do it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I think maybe.
Yeah, okay, that's right. So we have like 8 minutes.
Okay. I think these questions are very much related. So let me admit something to you. This talk, which I tried to complete in an hour, was the theme of a workshop that I conducted at Pune University in 5 hours, and which is why I was going so fast and trying to jump around to try to, make things cohere. If we are to understand, you'll see why I'm saying this. If we are to understand the way that the notion of the individual dignity gets put forward by Dr. Ambedkar, we need to understand the pre-Ambedkarite history of dignity in India, and that we can see by looking at Gandhi and Tagore and Savarkar and Golwalkar. And these Gandhian, Tagorean, and farther right ideas were all given voice in the drafting committee, which is why I had mentioned, introduction of class and unity of the nation and so on. Now, the individualist notion, all right, also when the drafting committee gave the Jan 21 draft, basically the preamble that we have today, they gave it to the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly then had 3 months to write what they thought about it, and then gave it back to the drafting committee for the drafting committee to make necessary adjustments. In March of 1948, this is a statement that came from the Constituent Assembly directed to Dr. Ambedkar. Please put the word unity of the nation first and the word dignity of the individuals second. And then Dr. Ambedkar replied, the reason for putting the dignity of the individual first was that unless the dignity of the individual is assured, the nation cannot be united. Now, we've heard Dr. Ambedkar say that dozens of times. 1919, 1927, 1930, as significant moments. Now, why I'm saying this is because the notion of the source of human dignity has largely been, in 19th century Indian thinking, has largely been some conception of the nation. Now, that conception arises from a very interesting battle that's taking place between the concept of autonomy, like we can think in this Kantian sense, and a rival concept from Tilak and Gandhi of Swaraj. So Swaraj was translated, if you remember, into English as home rule. Now, yeah, the sva is of course the self, and the word auto in autonomy, that originally had a sigma on it, a s, and so it's se auto in ancient Greek, and in Proto-European you get this sva that becomes sva in Sanskrit and auto in Greek and sui in Latin, right? So the sa, sui, auto, se auto, sva. So the self in all the Indo-European languages has this core conception. Now, what is the nature of that self? Well, in the autonomy liberal tradition, that self is itself the ground of dignity. But in a rival tradition that was shared very commonly in India, the sva is the community, right? So the body, the individual body and the body politic, they had a necessary correlation. And so in Gandhi's own writings, as everybody knows, the nature of the self and the nature of the community were often, they had to be in some sort of a harmony, some sort of a balance. But when Hind Swaraj was first published in 1909, it was translated in 1910, and then it was in English in India in 1919, there was a man in jail reading this book, and that was Savarkar. And in 1923, he produced Hindutva. And now, we don't normally like to make this association between the impact that Gandhi's Hind Swaraj had on Hindutva. But there are certain elements that get amplified in Hindutva, and then later, in one of the greatest books on this right-wing conception of the nation or nationhood in India, which is Golwarkar's We, Our Nationhood Defined. Now, incidentally, we is etymologically the same as sva. Okay, so what is this sva? What is this self? Is it axiomatically a dignified thing, or is it conditionally dignified depending on the nature of the nation and your inclusion or exclusion from it? Okay, I've got to speed this up. Basically, it's crucial to realize that in the Gandhian, I'm sorry to link them like this, okay, it's because of a shortage of time, but in this Gandhian and then Savarkarian and then Golwarkian conception of a book that now the RSS actually disavows and says Golwarkar didn't write it, the notion of what constitutes the self has 5 components. It's ethnos, or blood, ethnicity, which this gets into the citizenship thing. It's the soil, Hindustan. It's the language, Hindi. It's the religion, Hindu. And it is culture. Okay, so did you hear 3 words used there? Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan. Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan. Now this slogan of right-wing politics has always been, since Tilak's time, the basic conception of how an individual gets dignity. An individual gets dignity because of belonging or filling certain categories of what constitutes the we, the nation. And so the priority of the nation, this was always a battle, shouldn't, as it was stated in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar put unity of nation before dignity of the individual. And Ambedkar says no, because we will not have a unity in our nation until we recognize the dignity of the individual. Now the reason I say this is trying to correlate a few things. One, why this the need for harping on the dignity of the individual. It's not a liberal Kantian conception that Ambedkar has at all. It's not that liberal Kantian conception because it is not the liberal autonomous individual of Main's kind of contract. So Ambedkar shares with Hegel the critique of the autonomous individual, stating that where do you get this rational agent who signs the contract? Why? This is a bit of the Marxist thinking in Ambedkar's thought, because if within, let's say, the Lockean proviso that every person is entitled to the fruits of his labor, as a consequence of that proviso declaration of our fundamental autonomy and right, we get a situation where 300 million people are indentured slaves, servants, then there's got to be something wrong with this conception. So Ambedkar wants to challenge the free contract conception because we know that while theoretically this might be useful, socially, there is no freedom of contract amongst India's laboring masses. So we might attribute to them the volition to engage in a contract, but socially, that's not the reality. So he wants to reject that. Now, just the last point here, then, if there's this problem of individual and there's this problem of nation, and Ambedkar has to stay away from the nation side because of what I told you, Savarkar and Golwalkar and so on, but he also has to stay away from the individualist, hyper-autonomous Kantian side because of the impracticality of that in Indian social realities. The place where he goes, I believe, is a Hegelian maneuver so we recognize self-respect. Self-respect is a priority, like was first said. Self-respect, the speech at Mahad in the tank satyagraha. So all throughout the 1920s, Ambedkar is saying, stop eating carrion to the Dalit communities. Stop Maharki. Stop doing this work, Balutadar system. Stop doing all of these things and have self-respect. Some of his greatest students, like Dayapavad or Ignatavad, they then start spreading this around in Mahar communities, Hmang communities. Dr. Ambedkar has taught us that essential to the path of our freedom is self-respect. And yet Dr. Ambedkar realized that self-respect is nothing if it's not recognized. So the next state or stage is, of course, from the self, is the civil society, that realm of competition, that domain of competition, which Marx thought was nothing but the economy. Kant and Hegel have a much more nuanced understanding of civil society, and I think it shares, in Hegel, it shares a lot of similarity with Smith's theory of moral sentiments. So, because Hegel speaks of it as a kind of miracle, that competing interests produce outcomes of benefit to both parties. So I was trying to sell him this book at a fixed price because somehow the same dead and dumb object, his money is worth more to me than this book, and this book is worth more to him than the money. So while we're competing in this exchange, miraculously, value is added in social relations. So how is it that civil society, which is a domain of competition and self-interest, miraculously creates harmony and value? So this the Smithian notion seems to sneak in with Hegel. With Ambedkar, the problem is what's going on in civil society is that the people who engage in civil society are a caste, Banyas. And this is a peculiar perversion of Indian social reality, which is that civil society is not an open domain of competition. It is a closed domain of chosen competitors. And so you can't apply the same philosophy or logic when you to our ground realities as you apply to theories of competition. So what's the solution is the third moment. So if it's not self-respect, the self, and it's not civil society, it is the state. And what happens at the state is that you implement in law, you make objective the necessary conditions of the recognition of the subject. So in Hegel's philosophy of right, if you remember, you go from the subject to the person to the subject to the individual. That's a movement like family, civil society, the state in Hegel's philosophy of right. That is from subjective, self-respect, I value myself, that's what Ambedkar was teaching everyone to do, to the objective, which is that the state by law commands you to respect the other, not engage in. That's what all of our Articles 14 to 17 are about. The state enforcing objectively my own self-respect. And then this so-called absolute moment in Hegel is, of course, a kind of mutuality that occurs in the concept of recognition. Because in Hegel, if you remember, recognition means nothing if you recognize my superiority, because I don't want to be recognized by an inferior, I want to be recognized by an equal. So that absolute moment in Ambedkar materializes only in an open future. So this is what, by the end of his life, he's trying to continue to try to push both the subjective side of people, develop yourself, cultivate yourself, have self-respect, and the objective side. The state must ensure, like the German Constitution, first article, human dignity is inviolable. It is the duty of the state to preserve and protect it. So the closest thing that comes to Ambedkar's idea of the mediation between self and the other is this German conception that the state is there because of our peculiar social relations. And the Nazi society was peculiar too. They had just murdered 6 to 10 million people for being being either queer or Jewish or whatever. So that was as peculiar as the Indian circumstance, which has kept hundreds of millions of people indentured. So the duty of the state in this peculiar situation is to promote human dignity. I hope I addressed each of the questions by linking them in that way. Okay.
Also, Kant says treat human beings as ends in themselves, never as means only. He allows for the possibility
Means only.
of human beings being treated as means in terms of the Smith.
The only is crucial.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for coming in. Thank you very much, Akash, for this very engaging talk, and I hope we carry on the discussion even outside the room. Just to end, we have a tradition here of felicitating the speaker with some mementos. So, Sucharita, go ahead.
I think a student. No, anybody. No, I can do it if nobody wants to. And after this, we'll have lunch, and with the author in T4, anybody can come and join us for lunch as well.
I don't know what's in there.
Wow,
but this is
thank you so much. Thank you. And now.
Thanks very much for coming.